The pod woke me with a sound I'd never heard it make. In 9 years of hauling freight to the fringe contracts, I had learned every noise that pod could produce. The settling tick of the hull as it cooled, the low gargle of the recyclers, the chime that meant a docking clamp had found me. This was none of those. This was a flat two-tone bleat, the kind of sound a machine makes when it has decided something about you, and I came up out of the seat with my hand already reaching for a wrench that wasn't there. The viewport was full of green. Not the green of a station bay or a docking ring. Living green. Wet green. A wall of growth so dense it had no edges, leaves the size of doors hanging heavy with water, and beyond them a sky the color of old brass. The pod had set down on its belly in a clearing of black soil, and the soil was already drinking the heat off the hull, hissing where the two met. I sat there for a moment and did the thing I always did first, which was nothing. I let my eyes move and my hands stay still. Panic is a tax you pay before you've earned anything, and I'd stopped paying it a long time ago, in a different line of work, on a different world, where the ground I was standing on could open up and swallow a crew in the time it took to shout. The manifest screen was blinking. I keyed it. Candidate 009, it said, unassigned, reserve intake complete. I read it twice. Then I read the line under it, which said my pod's contractor registry had been merged with a candidate batch out of a relay station 3 jumps back, and that the merge had been flagged, and that the flag had been cleared by someone whose authorization code meant nothing to me. Somewhere in a building I would never see, a clerk had looked at 2 numbers that were 1 digit apart and decided they were the same number. And so a man who had come to drop off 4 crates of medical consumables had instead been delivered, alive and breathing and entirely unconsulted, to the start line of something called the Long Reserve. I want to be honest about what I felt, because the species that ran this place spent 90 days trying to find out and never managed it. What I felt was annoyance. The pure, low-grade annoyance of a man who has been put in the wrong line at the wrong window and now has to wait for someone to fix it. I didn't feel fear. I'd done my fearing decades ago and had no more in stock. I felt the specific irritation of a delivery gone wrong, and underneath it, faint, the part of me that had spent 20 years in the back country lifting its head and sniffing the air. The hatch wouldn't open from the inside. Of course it wouldn't. I found that out in about 4 seconds, which was 3.5 seconds longer than I needed to understand what kind of place I'd been dropped into. A survival course locks its candidates out, not in. You go where you're put and you live or you don't. So I waited for someone to come, tell me there'd been a mistake. The someone came an hour later, and he was not the kind of someone who tells you there's been a mistake. He came down through the green without disturbing it, which I noticed, because nothing that big should be able to move through brush like that without a sound. He was 1.5 heads taller than me, built like a thing assembled out of dark armored plates with the joints showing, and his skin, if that's the word, was the deep brown-black of a beetle's back, faintly iridescent where the brass light caught it. Heat shimmered off him in visible waves. Whatever he was, he ran hot, and he shed the heat through long fluted ridges that ran down his spine and forearms like the fins on an old radiator. When he breathed, the ridges flexed. When he stopped, they went still. He looked at the pod. He looked at me through the viewport. And then he tapped a panel on his forearm and the hatch unsealed with a sigh, and the air of that world came in, hot and green and thick with the smell of rot and growth, the smell of a place where everything was busy either living or being eaten. Out, he said. The translator in my collar gave me the word a half beat after his mouth, if that's the word, had finished with it. His own voice under the translation was a series of dry clicks, like seed pods cracking. I think there's been a filing error, I said. Out, he said again, not louder. He didn't do louder. He did the same flat click, the way you'd repeat an instruction to a tool that hadn't responded. I stepped down onto the black soil of Severid, and it took my boots and held them, soft and warm, and I understood in my legs before I understood it in my head that I was going to be here a while. He told me the shape of it standing there in the clearing. While the heat came off him in waves, I could feel from 3 steps away. His name, the translator decided, was Drask, and his rank was Reserve Master, and the long reserve was the final filter of the selector rate. The place candidates came when the classrooms and the simulators and the examination halls had taught the institution everything they could about a mind, and left only one question unanswered, which was whether the body and the will behind the mind could endure a world that wanted them dead. 90 days, he said. 1 world. 1 issued instrument. Extraction at the end, at a marked point 11 kilometers north on the 90th day and not before, because the trial did not measure how fast you could quit. It measured whether, at the end of 90 days, there was still something standing at the extraction point worth pulling out. Then he held out the instrument. It was a blade. A single blade as long as my forearm, full tang, a heavy spine and a flat grind, the kind of tool a person who knew tools would look at and respect. The handle was wrapped in some dark cord, and the steel, it wasn't steel, but it was steel enough, had a working edge, not a parade edge. Somebody who understood blades had made it. I turned it over once in my hand and felt the balance, and felt, for the first time since the pod woke me, something that was almost not annoyance. Each candidate receives 1, Drask said. No shelter, no fire, no ration, no second instrument. The reserve provides what the reserve provides. Most species require the full term to demonstrate that they can hold the line of survival. His ridges flexed, a slow ripple down the spine, and I would learn over the next 90 days that this was the closest his kind came to a shrug. Your species is not on the schedule. You will be observed. My species came to drop off some bandages, I said. You will be observed, he said again, and he turned and went back into the green the way he'd come, without sound, and the brass sky pressed down, and I was alone on a world built to kill things softer than I was, holding a good knife and an old habit. I want to tell you I did something clever in that first hour. I didn't. The cleverest thing a man can do in that first hour is exactly nothing dramatic. I walked the clearing. I found where the soil drained and where it held water. I found the high ground at the clearing's northeast lip, a shelf of gray rock that the brush hadn't conquered, and I found that the wind, there was wind, a steady push out of the brass west, broke against that rock and slid up and over it. I stood on the rock and turned a slow circle and read the land the way you read a fire's behavior, which is to say, I asked it where it wanted to go and made my plans to be somewhere else. Then I sat down on the rock and I built nothing at all for the rest of that first day except a clear understanding of where I was. Because the back country taught me a thing that the simulator and examination crowd had apparently never learned, which is that the wild is not a fight. It's a negotiation, and you don't open a negotiation by swinging. I was not the only candidate. I learned that on the second day, when I went down off my rock to find water and found instead a creature dead at the edge of the clearing, half into the brush, its limbs locked in the posture of something that had been trying very hard to be somewhere else when it stopped. It was nothing I had a name for. 6 limbs, a body like a deer crossed with a centipede, a hide of overlapping plates gone dull. Around its mouth was a froth of pale sap and the bitten stems of a broad violet-leafed plant, and it didn't take a botanist to read the story. It had been hungry, and it had eaten the wrong thing, and the wrong thing had killed it inside an hour. Its blade was still in its grip, the same blade I had, 1 issued instrument, and it had used it to cut the plant that killed it. I crouched there a long while. I'm not a sentimental man. The work I used to do burns that out of you fast or it kills you, but I take the dead seriously, because the dead are the only honest teachers a place like this has. This one had taught me 3 things without meaning to. The violet plant was poison. The candidates were dying in the first 2 days, and I was being measured against creatures who would eat the first green thing they found, which told me the institution's idea of survival and mine were not the same idea at all. I left the blade where it was. I had my own. And I went and found water because that comes first, before food, before shelter, before anything, and any survival course that issues a knife and turns you loose without saying so out loud has already told you it expects you to know. The water I found was bad. A standing pool at the clearing's low edge, skinned with something that moved. I didn't touch it. I followed the lay of the land downhill, slow, reading the brush for the lighter green that means roots can reach a water table, until I found a seep coming out of a rock face, clear and cold and running, which is a different animal entirely from standing water. Running water has been arguing with the rock long enough to leave most of its sins behind. Standing water is a held breath. I still wouldn't drink it raw. I hadn't seen what lived in it and I never assume. But running water I could work with. That was the end of day 2. I had a knife, a rock shelf, a seep, a poisoned plant identified, and a dead neighbor. By the standards of the place, I was apparently doing remarkably well, which tells you more about the place than about me. By day 4, I had a fire. I want to be plain about the fire, because the fire was where Drask first came back to watch, and where I first understood that I was being studied the way a man studies an animal that is doing something animals aren't supposed to do. A fire on a wet world is not the fire of a dry one. You don't get a spark to catch on green tinder and you don't pretend you will. You go up. You find the standing dead, and there's always standing dead, even in the wettest country, because things die faster than they fall. And you split it down to the dry heart with the blade and the back of the blade and a baton of harder wood, and you take the driest shavings off the driest core, and you build them into a structure that wants to burn, and then you make fire the way people made it before there were people, which is with patience and friction, and a bow drilled out of the same dead wood, and a cord cut from inner bark twisted into something that'll hold tension. It took me most of a day to make the kit and most of an hour to make the coal. And when the coal came, I fed it the way you feed a frightened animal, slow, no sudden moves, and I had flame an hour before the brass sky went dark. Drask was at the edge of the clearing when I looked up. I don't know how long he'd been there. His kind didn't fidget and they didn't shift their weight, and a thing that runs that hot doesn't need a fire and would never make one, so I think the fire is what brought him. A creature that sheds heat, watching a creature that summons it. You burn the world, he said. I burn the dead parts of it, I said, and fed the flame another splinter. The live parts I'm leaving alone. His ridges flexed, the slow ripple. Fire is a late competence, he said. In most species, among those that achieve it at all, it is observed near the end of the term when a candidate has exhausted other means and grows desperate. I'm not desperate, I said. I'm cold, which was true. The brass days were hot and the nights came down fast and hard, and a wet cold will take more out of you over 90 nights than any single bad day ever will, and I had no intention of spending 90 nights losing an argument with the dark. He watched the fire a while longer. Then he said the thing I would think about, on and off, for the rest of the term. You are not enduring, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a man revising a category. Endurance has a shape. We know its shape. The shoulders curve. The movements short. The candidate spends and does not replace, and the line of survival drops day by day until it crosses the floor and the candidate is gone. That is endurance. You are not doing that. Your line is rising. I'm settling in, I said. Settling in, he repeated, and the translator gave me no help with what his voice did underneath it, but I think it was the first time I had said a thing he had no drawer to put it in. He left without another word. The fire popped. The dark came down. I slept under a lean-to of split deadwood and broad leaves with the fire banked at the entrance, and I slept the whole night through, which I would bet good money no other candidate on that world managed in 90 days. Let me tell you about the others, because they're the part of this I think about most, and the part I least enjoy. There were 9 of us at the start. I never met 7 of them alive. I met them the way I met the centipede deer, after the world had finished with them, because the reserve scatters its candidates wide, and a man who wants to live doesn't go wandering 11 kilometers of death world looking for company. But the reserve is not large, and over 90 days you cross old ground, and the dead don't move. There was the one in the ravine who had built a shelter, a good one, by the look of it, better engineering than mine, walls woven tight, and had built it in the bottom of the ravine, because the bottom was flat and sheltered from the wind, and had drowned in it the first time the brass sky opened up and the ravine became a river in 40 minutes. The wild punishes a great many things, but it punishes nothing so reliably as building in the low ground. I'd read that land on day one from my rock and known not to go down into it. He'd read comfort and gone toward it. The wild does not grade for comfort. There was the one I never found at all, only the signs of a churned patch of ground, dragged back brush, a single plate of hide the size of my hand, and the kind of silence that a place gets after something large has eaten well. Something hunted on Severid. I'd known that from the first night, from sounds I couldn't place and didn't go looking for. I had built my settlement with that in mind. Fire on the perimeter, a clear field around the shelf, deadfall traps not for food at first, but for warning, tripped lines of dry rattling pods strung through the brush, so that nothing came up on me in the dark without announcing itself. He, whoever he was, had been quieter and more clever than me in every way except the one that counted, which was that he had not, apparently, believed that the dark wanted him. And there was the one I did meet alive. It was day 30-something. I'd lost the precise count, though I kept the rough one with notches on a post, the way you do, and I was up on the north ridge scouting the line toward the extraction point, just to know the ground before I needed it, when I came on a creature crouched in the lee of a boulder, and it was alive, and it looked at me with eyes set in a flat gray face, and it did not run, which told me it was past running. It was thin in the way that frightens you, the thin of a thing that has been spending and not replacing, exactly the shape Drask had described. Its issued blade was gone, lost, or thrown, or never understood. It had been eating bark. I could see the marks of it, gnawing bark off the boulder's lone scrub tree because bark was what it could reach without strength enough to do better. It had given up on the world, and the world was taking its time. I should tell you that some hard calculus went through my head, that I weighed the rules and the risk and my own thin margins. The truth is simpler. I'd spent 20 years pulling people off mountains and out of burns and away from rivers, and you don't do that work for 20 years and then walk past a living thing that's dying slow because a clipboard somewhere says each candidate stands alone. The clipboard wasn't on the ridge with me. The dying thing was. I couldn't carry it back to my settlement, 11 kilometers of bad ground, and it couldn't walk it, and I had no way to make it. So I did what I could where it was. I built it a fire, small, banked, with enough split deadwood beside it to last 2 nights if it had the sense to feed it. I made it water boiled in a bark vessel with hot stones, the way you do when you've no pot, then cooled. I brought it the one food I trusted absolutely, a tuber I'd been living on for a month, a fat pale root that grew along the seeps and that I'd tested the careful way, a touch to the lip, a weight, a taste, a weight, a small amount, a weight, the slow ladder you climb when the price of a wrong rung is your life. I'd climbed that ladder a dozen times by then and had a whole larder of safe food because of it. I gave the gray thing a heap of cooked tuber and showed it, slow, what to do, and I sat with it while it ate the first of it. Because a thing that's given up needs to be shown that the giving up was early. Then I left, because I had a settlement 11 kilometers south that needed me at it before dark, and because there is a hard edge on every mercy in a place like that, and the edge of mine was that I would not die for a stranger I couldn't save. I gave it what would let it save itself. The rest was its. I don't know if it lived. The extraction took me out a different way, and I never crossed that ground again. I think about it. I'd built a manned fires before and watched some of them live and some of them day after, and you learn to set the not knowing down or it follows you home. But I think the gray thing is the reason Drask started coming more often. Because the next time he appeared at the edge of my clearing, 3 days after the ridge, he stood there a long while before he spoke, and when he spoke it wasn't about me at all. "You went up the North Ridge," he said, "scouting the extraction line. You stopped at the boulder." So they were watching the whole world then, drones or buried sensors or his own kind out there in the green where I'd never see them. It didn't surprise me. I stopped at the boulder. "That candidate is recovering," Drask said, and his ridges did something I hadn't seen them do, a fast flutter and then a hard stillness. It had crossed the floor. The line had dropped through the floor. By every measure we have, it was finished. It is not finished. Its line is rising. He turned his flat head toward me and the brass light ran down his plates. "You did that, with instrument and fire and a root. You reached into a candidate's death and reversed it. And you did it for a thing that is not your species, that you had never seen, that could give you nothing, in violation of the structure of the trial. And you did it without hesitation, in the time it took to make a fire. And then you walked away and resumed your own survival as though you had done something ordinary." "Where I'm from," I said, "we have a name for the thing where you walk past somebody dying because the rules say to. It's not a name you'd want." He was quiet a long time. The fire ticked. Somewhere off in the dark, a thing that hunted made the sound it made, and one of my rattling pod lines stirred and went quiet again, the perimeter doing its work. "The reserve is a filter," Drask said at last, and there was something in it I hadn't heard from him before, the sound of a man working out loud at a thing that had stopped fitting. "We built it to find the species that can hold the line of their own survival under a world's full weight. That is the whole of the question. Can the candidate alone keep itself alive? We did not build it to measure a candidate who keeps others alive while doing so. We did not think that shape would occur. A candidate at the edge of its own margins does not spend those margins on a stranger. That is not endurance. That is not survival. That is," and the translator stalled, gave me a long pause, and then offered a word I don't think it was confident in, "that is settlement. You are not surviving the reserve. You are settling it." I added a splinter to the fire. "Yeah," I said, "that's the word." I should describe what I'd built by then, because Drask used that word, settlement, and meant it, and it's the heart of why the title of this whole business is what it is. By day 60, I had something on that gray rock shelf that no one would have called a survival camp. A survival camp is what you make when you intend to leave. This was what you make when you've decided to stay. The shelter was the third one I'd built, each better than the last, because the backcountry teaches you that your first build is a draft, and you tear it down without sentiment the moment you understand the ground better. This one was framed in standing deadwood lashed with twisted inner bark cord, walled in a tight weave of withies daubed with the black clay I'd found down at the seep, roofed in overlapping broad leaves shingled so the rain ran off and away and not in. It was dry. After 90 days on a wet world, I cannot tell you what a thing it is to be dry. The gray light came through a smoke gap, and the smoke went out the same gap, drawn by a low fire I kept always burning now, banked through the day and built up at dark. I had water I trusted, the seep, run through a filter I'd layered out of charcoal from my own fire and sand from the rock and crushed fiber, into a vessel of fired clay, because by then I'd learned the clay would fire, learned it the way you learn everything out there, by trying it and watching it crack, and trying it again with a slower fire and less temper until it held. I had 3 of those vessels. One for water, one for cooking, one for storing the dried root and the dried strips of the small fish I'd learned to trap in the running seep. I had a smokehouse, if you can call a clay-daubed box of withies a house. I had a drying rack. I had a row of deadfall and snare traps that fed me more than I could eat, so that I ate the best of it and dried the rest, and the dried larder grew against the day the brass sky might close over for a week and keep me off the land. I had a latrine sited downhill and downwind and far, because the fastest way to die slow in a fixed camp is to foul your own water, and I had no intention of dying of something so stupid after surviving everything that had tried so hard. I had a wood store under cover, 2 weeks deep. I had a map scratched into a slab of bark with a charcoal stick, the 11 kilometers north to the extraction point, and every hazard I'd marked along the way. The ravine that became a river, the boulder, the violet poison plants range, the place the hunter had eaten well. And I had time. That's the thing the reserve never accounted for, and the thing that makes me, of all the species the selectorate ever ran through that world, the one Drask's people are apparently still arguing about. I had built a life that took less than half a day to maintain, and so I had half a day every day that was simply mine. I made a chair. I'll tell you that and you can make of it what you like. I made a chair out of deadwood and bark cord with a back that leaned just right. And in the long brass afternoons when the camp was squared away and the larder was full and the perimeter was sound, I sat in my chair by my fire on a world built to kill me, and I rested. That was the day Drask brought the others. There were 4 of them, his kind, the heat coming off them in a shimmer you could see from across the clearing, and they came out of the green and stopped at the edge of it and did not come closer, and I understood I was being shown. I stayed in my chair. I'd long since stopped getting up for him. He'd never given me reason to think the courtesy would be returned, and a man keeps his dignity in small ways when the large ways have been taken from him. They looked at the shelter. They looked at the smokehouse and the drying rack and the wood store and the filter and the fired clay and the chair and the man in it. One of them clicked something to Drask and Drask clicked back and the translator gave me none of it, this being a conversation I wasn't meant to follow, and I didn't try. I watched my fire. Then Drask crossed the clearing alone and stood by my fire, and for a while he didn't shed his heat away from me the way he always had, polite in the one way his kind knew how to be. He stood and let it come, and I felt it, and I understood it for what it was, which was the nearest a creature like that could come to sitting down beside a man. They did not believe the recordings, he said. My superiors. They believed the recordings were altered or that you were a special case the selectorate had inserted to test the proctors. A planted candidate. Species do not do this. He gestured, a slow sweep of one plated arm taking in all of it, the shelter and the larder and the chair. Survive, yes. The strong ones survive. They claw through to the 90th day with nothing left, the line scraping along the floor, and we pull out a candidate that is barely a candidate anymore, hollowed, and we mark it a pass because it held the line. That is what a pass looks like. That is what a pass has always looked like. His ridges rippled. You have eaten well for 60 days. You have slept whole nights. You have grown stronger, not weaker. You have built a thing that will outlast you. And you have done it on the world that has the highest attrition in the entire selectorate program. A world we reserve for the candidates we most expect to lose, because it is the cleanest filter we own. It's a good world, I said. He went very still. It is a slaughterhouse. It's a good world, I said again, and I meant it, and that's the part I don't think he ever did manage to file. Water, wood, game, clay, good rock. A steady wind off the west you can read like a clock. Hot days, cold nights, rain you can see coming an hour out if you're watching the sky. The only thing wrong with this world is that you turn things loose on it that don't know how to live on it, and then you call the world the killer. I leaned back in my chair. Where I'm from, we had 100 worlds harder than this one and we lived on every one of them. Ice you'd lose a hand to. Deserts that cook the eyes out of your head. We carried fire into all of it and made it home. That's not endurance, master. Anybody can endure a thing for 90 days. We don't endure a place. We move in. The fire ticked. The brass light failed slowly toward the cold. How, Drask said, and it was the first time he had ever asked me anything that wasn't a test. We took everything from you. Tools, shelter, sustenance, the structure of a society, the knowledge stored in your institutions. We left you a single blade and a world that kills. By what mechanism does a creature so stripped reconstruct all of this from nothing? I thought about that one a while, because it deserved a true answer and not a clever one. "You didn't take everything," I said. "You took the things. The things aren't the knowledge. A man my age has split 10,000 cords of wood and made 1,000 fires and boiled water on 100 mountains, and all of that is in my hands and my eyes whether you give me a pot or not. You can't issue what I am. You issued me a knife, but the knife isn't the tool that built this." I held up my hands to the fire, scarred and burned and 40 years into their trade. "These are. And you can't take them because they're not in the kit. They're in the man." He didn't answer. I don't think he had an answer. He stood by my fire until the dark came down all the way, and then he went back across the clearing to the others, and they went into the green. And I built up my fire and slept whole through the night the way I'd done for 60 nights. And the perimeter held, and the hunter that hunted Severid passed by my camp the way it had learned to, wide. Because a thing that lives long enough to grow large learns the smell of a place that bites back. The 90th day came up out of a clear brass dawn. I'd known it was coming. The notches on my post said so, and so did the wind, which had started to swing as the season turned, and so did the larder, which I'd been running down on purpose for a week so I wouldn't leave good food to rot. A man who works the land learns to leave clean. I broke camp the way I'd built it, without waste and without hurry. I doused the fire and stirred the ash and scattered it. I pulled the deadfalls and sprang the snare so nothing would die in a trap I wasn't there to check, because a trap left set is a cruelty, and I don't leave cruelties behind me. I left the shelter standing. It would feed the world back its own dead wood in a season or two, and until then maybe the gray thing or something like it would find it and have a dry night out of my work. I rolled the bark map and tucked it in my collar. I took the blade. I left everything else, because everything else had come out of that world and belonged to it, and I walked the 11 kilometers north along the line I'd scouted on day 4 and refined a dozen times since, past the ravine running low and quiet in the dry of the season's turn, past the boulder where the gray thing had crouched, where there was now only a cold fire scar and a heap of gnawed root skins that told me it had eaten what I left and gone on. And I came up over the last rise to the extraction point an hour before the deadline, on time, the way I'd been on time for 9 years of deliveries before a clerk turned me into a candidate. Drask was there. So were a great many others of his kind, more than I'd ever seen at once, and a few that weren't his kind at all, slighter, paler, with the soft look of the ones who run the buildings and never the worlds. They were all looking at me come over the rise, and there was a quality to the looking I'd felt exactly once before, a long time ago, walking out of a burn I had no business walking out of, carrying a kid I had no business having reached, while the crew stood at the line and watched me come and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say. I walked up to Drask and stopped. I was thinner than I'd been on day 1, and harder and brown from the brass sun, and I had 90 days of beard and a good knife and a rolled bark map, and that was the entire inventory of what I'd carried out, except for the part you can't inventory. "Reserve master," I said. "Candidate," he said. Then his ridges did the slow ripple and he corrected himself, and I will carry the correction the rest of my life. "Settler." "I'd still like the filing error fixed," I said. "I came here to drop off 4 crates of medical consumables. Somewhere there's a clinic short on bandages because a clerk can't read." Something happened among the pale, soft ones at that, a fast clicking back and forth, and I gathered the medical consumables and the clerk, and the whole 90 days of it were arriving at them all at once in a way that was going to mean a very bad afternoon for somebody 3 jumps back at a relay station. "It will be corrected," Drask said, "the error and the rest." He looked at me a moment longer. "We will change the reserve." "How's that?" "The trial measures whether a candidate can hold the line of survival to the 90th day, he said. "It has measured that for longer than your species has had its fire. It is the cleanest question we know how to ask, and you have shown me that it is the wrong question. We have been measuring whether a creature can keep from dying. We never thought to measure whether a creature can begin to live. We did not know the second thing was possible on a world like this in 90 days alone. You built a home in the cleanest filter we own. The drawer we file survivors in is the wrong size for you. We will have to build a new one. His head tilted, the brass light running down his plates. We do not have a name for the new drawer yet. You'll think of something, I said. The extraction pod was warm and clean and bright, and it smelled of nothing at all. And after 90 days of a world that smelled of rot and growth and rain and wood smoke, the nothing was the strangest part of coming out. I sat in the seat and they sealed the hatch from the outside, still old habits. And through the viewport I watched the gray rock shelf I'd lived on shrink and the green close over it and severed turn under me, hot and wild and good. A slaughterhouse to the ones who ran it, and a long quiet posting to the one man who'd been filed there by mistake. I kept the knife. Nobody asked for it back and I didn't offer. It was a good blade. Somebody who understood blades had made it, and it had built a settlement, and a tool that's done honest work has earned a place in the kit of the man who used it. They got me my crates eventually. The clinic got its bandages 2 seasons late. The clerk I never heard about and didn't ask. But I heard, a long time after, through the kind of channel a freight contractor hears things through, that the selector rate had changed the long reserve. That they'd added a thing to the 90th day assessment that had never been there in all the generations they'd run it. They no longer only counted what was left alive at the extraction point. They counted what was built. They counted whether, when they came to pull the candidate out, there was something standing on that world that the world hadn't been able to tear down. A shelter, a larder, a filter, a chair. A settlement. They named the new mark after the species that taught them the question existed. I won't tell you what they named it. It's a small thing, and it's theirs now, not mine. I just dropped off the bandages.